Critchlow made a big thing about you couldn't just possess a tenant the first time because they come out. You have to take a tenant to court. They had a rent control order from the 20s. That Critchlow and others, the labor union insisted on. So the social struggle was also defined. But yet, you see, since these people came in a kind of slavery or semi-slavery serfdom, national pride did not disappear. And in voting, they would try to promote one of their own to the higher post. So if the leader was Indian, it made it easier for Indians to vote for that leader. If it was African, it made it easier for Africans to vote for that leader. And sometimes both of them would vote for Portuguese who were doing the work. That is wrong.
You can free up your nose a little bit, brother. You free up your nose a little.
I'm hearing.
No, I'm saying just free up your nose a little so you can breathe well.
What about my nose?
I'm saying you can free up your nose a little.
Okay.
See. You were talking about how when you went to the UN, some of the how Jagan.
CLR James called it racial rivalry when he came to Trinidad. He came back to Trinidad. He's from Trinidad. And he had explored the colonial thing with Padmore and all them in Africa and Ethiopia and all that. He was very much into that. And US labor struggle. He called it in the Caribbean racial rivalry.
Did you know CLR? Did you know CLR James?
Yeah.
What was your relationship with him?
Good.
Well, what did you do together? Did you work together on projects? Did you study together? What was your relationship?
No, he was far older than I. We couldn't study together. I never studied with anybody. In the sense that I never went to a high school or a university. I did some university studies as an external student. CLR James didn't even do that. They would invite him to universities to teach. See? But he was not a product of a university.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. He was teaching in Trinidad, I think. He went to Queen's Royal College, the best school, unlike me. He was able to go to high school. But he was self-developed.
Did he live in Guyana for a while?
No.
Okay.
He visited Guyana. He was also a cricket reporter. He used to report cricket for the Manchester Guardian. He wrote a book called Beyond the Boundary. And he was an excellent critic of art and so on.
I remember when I was home visiting you for a semester, and you went to his funeral. That was 1989. I remember when I was home, when Mama sent me home to be with you for a semester. I was 16.
Yeah.
And you left for a few days to go to his funeral, CLR James funeral. I remember that.
When he died.
Yeah, 1989.
The Oil Field Workers Union sent for me.
Yeah.
Paid my passage to go to CLR James funeral. That's 89. Yeah. Thank you for that, Kofi. I didn't remember that conjuncture.
You know, CLR James was close with two people from Detroit, or two people who lived in Detroit, James and Grace Boggs. Do you know them? Jimmy Boggs. Do you know him? Did you know him? And Grace Lee Boggs?
Yeah, I know their names.
Okay, they were part of
CLR, James' wife and I are very good friends up to now. She's in England.
Okay.
Yeah. She's in England. They had Kofi, they had on a birthday for me last year, and she was on the Zoom.
She's from Trinidad also?
She's from New York.
Oh, okay.
She's Jewish and always in the movement. The last thing she's on is a thing called Global Women's Strike. When CLR invited me to Trinidad, I stayed with them in 1959. First time I left the country. No, second time I left the country. First time I went to Trinidad. I stayed with them, and they made me see the carnival because they said they're not giving me my passport until the carnival was over. So I had to remain to see. I'm very glad I saw carnival.
So were you a Trotskyite?
No.
The CLR was, yes.
I heard he was a Trotskyite. I didn't know him in those days. He broke with it. You know. I've read some of his stuff, you know.
I met him once in 1975.
Yeah.
At a conference in D.C.
Where?
In Washington, D.C.
Uh-huh.
The National Independent Black Political Party had a conference and he was speaking at it. The National Black Independent Political Party had a conference in Washington, D.C. and he was speaking at the conference.
Oh, yeah.
So, Baba, I want you to get to this thing with the African group because there's a part of Baba Malik's story that I'm trying to connect. Because I interviewed him one time, you may have heard it on the radio, when he was talking about some of his activity.
Who?
Baba Malik, the same person here with us. So I was intrigued by aspects of what you shared before about the meeting. So when you went to UN and you came, you shared the background about why it was important for you to speak to them because of the propaganda advantage that Jagan had.
Who?
The UN, the African group at the UN.
Oh, why it was important for me to speak for them?
Yes.
You're asking why?
No, you just shared with us why. You gave the background in terms of the so I'm asking you to go into what you said to them. Baba Malik hasn't heard that story. You've shared it with me before, but
I can't be. I have to give the setting.
Yes.
The bulk of Africans in Guyana, like everywhere else, were Christianized, subject to Christian-led propaganda. They were therefore, naturally, unless they went into a study of it, they were hostile to the Soviet Union, which was known to be atheistic, having no God. So people like the Dean of Canterbury, Hewlett Johnson, wrote books promoting the Soviet Union as a country practicing Christianity as Jesus talked about it, love one another and that kind of thing. The wealthy people were not tolerated and the wealth of the country was supposed to be as evenly distributed as possible. Of course, it went crazy and that did not happen. So Jagan latched on to that kind of thing, which after the Second World War was very, very popular. Very, very popular. The Soviet Union also had shown its strength by coming into the war after Hitler attacked them and making all the difference. Defeating Hitler, Stalingrad and all that kind of thing. So they had great popularity. Jagan latched on to all of that. You had a man like Paul Robeson, my hero, who was such a brilliant artist. And Paul Robeson, his son wrote a thing called The Tallest Tree, you know it? Mm-hmm. Yes, you would know it.
Did you ever meet Paul Robeson?
Never. But I met him in the spirit. I listened to his recordings. I used to sing the Chinese national anthem because I heard Paul Robeson sing it in Chinese. And we used to teach it in Guyana. There are people in Guyana up to now, when they see me, would say Chilai. That's from the Chinese national anthem. It means arise. Arise. Tianjin. March on. I can sing it now, but I stopped singing it because of the Chinese behavior there.
Oh, yeah. Well, can you sing just a little bit of it?
Woman Sunday sing Mojo Dirandi Bao Chen Jing Chen Jing Mojo Dirandi Bao Chen Jing Chen Jing Chen Jing Jing. Arise, you who refuse to be born slaves. Let's stand up and fight for liberty and true democracy. All the world is facing the chains of the tyrant. Everyone who fights for freedom now is crying. Chiloy, Chiloy, Chiloy. Women Sandy sing, oh, children po. Chen Jing, Chen Jing, mo children po. Chen Jing, Chen Jing, Chen Jing, Jing. That was Paul Robeson.
Thank you.
And we taught it to members of the Demerara Youth Rally, which we founded in Guyana in 1962, and all of that, you know. And we used to have Paul Robeson records at the roadside playing for people to hear his messages.
You know, I had no idea Paul Robeson had an influence in Guyana.
You wouldn't know.
No, I didn't. It's the first I've ever heard this.
Yeah. Mrs. Jagan, Jagan's wife, felt he was the greatest American of the 20th century because he was really leading the movement in the USA, being an artist and a political person, you see? And he understood the theoretical background and the historical, like anything, and he could make things very clear. I can't continue that. Anyway, Kofi asked me to say what I said at the United Nations. So Jagan, very cleverly, Burnham, as I said, having this mass of Christians to deal with as his racial base, if we can be concrete. Jagan had a racial base of Indians who are Hindus and Muslims. And for them, religion and politics, you know, politics was not influenced by belief and that kind of thing. Politics was influenced by bread and butter. So the Africans were not like that. You had to convince them directly or indirectly that you were not anti-religious, anti-church. You get it? So that I mean, I know that because I grew up in it. Many people will tell you about Guyana and don't even mention that. But that was the subtle thing. And people just not believe in God, you know? And that kind of thing. But I got up and supported Jagan in that context. So you can guess the difficulty because people had this double standard. But I happen to be from the church myself. So that did not apply to me. And I knew how to use the Christian gospel to preach revolution. Get it?
Yes.
When necessary. Good. I didn't do it too much, but I knew all the passages and so on. So I am explaining now why the other political parties, apart from Japan, were very cautious, and he used to overplay the Russian thing to embarrass them. And then he would say, they are stooges of the British. They wouldn't do this, they wouldn't do that, they wouldn't say this, they wouldn't say that. Because all the parties had to be cautious. They had Degar, who was a businessman, and they always had to look what the mass of people think about church. And so Jagan had this propaganda that the Africans did not want independence. He was fighting for independence now, but the Africans were fighting for internal self-government as a next step and questioning the franchise in voting system which permitted a party like the PPP to sweep the board. That was the conflict.
Mhm.
It is not that the other, it's not that Burnham did not want independence. Burnham wanted power like any politician, and independence meant power for the person who wins independence. It always meant that throughout the colonial world. I am not I'm not saying this to paint up Burnham's image. I mean, I know Burnham's viciousness as well as anybody else. I have to fight it with my life. You know, I had to fight it. I know how he supported corruption. I never said that he himself stole money. I have no evidence of that, but he supported people in the party stealing from the government. And I took them to inquiries. They had a major inquiry about two of them, and both of them were found faulty.
This was what year?
Hmm?
What year was that?
After 71, between 71 and 73. Yeah. So what did I tell the African group? I know that they were conflicted. They wanted to support Africans in the diaspora, but here it is, Jagan was showing more fight for independence than the African leader. I was seen as a puzzle because I spoke out for Africa, and at the same time, I was not anti-communist. Get it? I spoke liberation, workers' liberation, national liberation, as consistently as any communist. So I was a problem. You get it?
Yes.
Yeah. They could fit me in. They could say I was a stooge because I came very far from that thing. So when we went with this background, I'm addressing the African group. When they heard of this mainly, they crowded the room. Everybody from every African country was there. After I was introduced, this is my first statement. The fight for independence in Guyana began in 1763 when our African ancestors, Kofi and Akara, rose in rebellion in Burbi and drove the Dutch across the river out of the country and held power for 11 months before the revolution was put down by warships and troops from St. Eustatius, the Dutch island. Brother, you see the relaxation? the tension dissolved at once, and we began to talk.
Is this Kofi named after that Kofi who led that rebellion? Your son Kofi?
No.
No?
Kofi is named after a book. In fact, they used to call the original Kofi Coffee. Cuffy. Corrupting the real word. There was nobody named Coffee. It was Kofi. But in Creole, we called it coffee. And that's how that coffee, that, his name was even written Cuffy in some history book. The historians didn't know what Kofi was. So that was my first. And then I went on to show that since voting had become racial after the split in the PPP, the electoral system was a severe disadvantage. I showed how, according to the 1971 election, 1971, according to the most recent election, the PPP could win one seat for every 4,500 votes cast. But the PNC, which was the African-based party, needed 11,000 votes to win one seat. And the Portuguese-led party needed something like 12,000 votes. No. 4,500 would give the PPP a seat. 9,000 will give the PNC a seat, and 11,500 will give the Portuguese a seat. They are Amerindian native population. And that made a great impression. So the electoral system had to be changed while the voting was racial. And that was injustice. So I didn't have to distort anything. I just told it as it was, and people began to shake their heads. By the time I was finished, all the representatives were around me giving me their cards. When you go to Africa, look, this is the number. You must go and see the old man. The old man is the president, or the prime minister. They call all them the old man. And they gave me the telephone number, their cards, and
So this was what year was this? 64, you say?
Huh?
This was 1964?
1964, December. I got to Africa, I got to Ghana around Christmas time. I think it was in England at Christmas. I went to the Ghana embassy, and they quickly gave me a visa. The Nigerian embassy was difficult to deal with. They had a lot of formalities and so on. So they have to see the chancery. But anyway, I got in touch with a Nigerian diplomat named Joseph Iyala. And I met him at several places in the continent. He was like the senior African diplomat in the USA. I remember they were confused about my way of life, because I didn't drink and sport around and all the rest of it. I spent my time reading, studying, investigating, talking with people. Joey Yala said to me one day, Sydney, that was my name. When you die and go and God asks you how you enjoyed life on earth, what are you going to tell him?
You know, Baba, I will never tire of asking you that story because I will never tire of asking you to narrate that thing with the United Nations because every time you bring out another element. This time you brought out the religious element.
And yes, I don't know the strength of it.
Right.
I don't know what these brothers come here to discuss. I just heard somebody come in at 10 o'clock.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can't prepare myself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I'm saying I'm glad I asked you again. Yeah. Because I know you don't like to tell the same story twice. But I want to jump to Baba Malik because when I interviewed Baba Malik, I thought of you a lot because you were telling me about we were talking about the time around this, I think the 6th Pan-African Congress. What year was that?
73, I think.
So that's 10 years later then, basically. Yeah, 73.
That was on 1974.
Oh, okay. He's probably right. Okay. I think that's right.
We are preparing for it in 1973.
He's got incredible memory.
Yeah. So I want to ask Baba Malik to share some of his story because at that time you were a young organizer. You were helping.
In 1974, I graduated from high school in 1974. What did you say?
I was asking Baba Malik to chime in on some of his story because I remember talking to him about around the 6th Pan-African Congress.
Yeah.
I was trying to connect some dots. And so I'm asking him to share a little bit of his story now.
Good. So I was in high school in 1974. I didn't know anything at that time about six-pack. I learned about that in 1975.
Okay.
The next year, because I joined an organization called the Pan-African Congress.
Pan-African Congress?
Yes, USA. It was modeled after the PAC of Azania. And so several members of the PAC USA went to six-pack in Tanzania, including a brother who just passed 2 weeks ago named Edward Vaughn, who owned Vaughn's bookstore. Edward Vaughn?
Yeah.
Did you know him?
I heard of him.
So he owned a bookstore in Detroit for many years, a black bookstore, which was the center of black radical political activity. And he just passed 2 weeks ago. They had his funeral in Dothan, Alabama. He moved from Detroit back to where he's from in Dothan about 20 years ago.
Spell it?
Vaughn, Vaughn.
Yeah.
You know him?
I heard of him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think my wife probably knew him. Vaughn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So he had one of the oldest bookstores. Maybe I think Marcus Bookstore was the oldest black bookstore.
In Oakland.
Marcus.
Yes.
In San Diego.
In San Francisco, in Oakland.
And then Vaughn's was the second oldest.
So my one in San Diego too.
Auntie Shakuru took me to the one in Oakland.
Yeah.
Years ago.
Yes, I know that one too.
Yeah.
So
I spoke there at the meeting.
Okay.
When I visited on the Rodney tour. Yeah.
So my knowledge of six-pack is from talking to people who were there. Hakeem Adabuti, who was one of my teachers, he was there. A sister in Detroit named Barbara Winder, who I just talked to last week, was with Ed Vaughn at six-pack. And she was telling me last week how they met Idi Amin. Idi Amin took them to Uganda. They flew in the helicopter with Amin and looked at the country. I'm not supporting Idi Amin. I'm just relating the story. So all of my knowledge of six-pack is from older people who I talked to who went there. I don't have any direct knowledge.
But just what you said there, because even about Idi Amin, because what I remember from our conversation with you was that you were talking about how when you joined that organization, the PAC,
yes,
how you all started becoming aware of some of the contradictions.
Yeah.
The other day I was on the radio talking to my uncle Horace Campbell, but after the radio we kept talking.
Is he still in New York? Syracuse?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he was using Idi Amin as an example to share something with me, share what he thought I should consider. We were talking about this current politics and everything. And I was going on about, how I don't trust the Democrats much more than the Republicans, blah, blah, blah. He said, well, he used Idi Amin as an example of how in that time, for those people who saw the contradictions in somebody like Idi Amin, they had to be very clear in their discourse with the people who had a platform, right? To say, because Idi Amin was also hated by the imperialists.
Yes.
So it would seem like he must be, revolutionary. He must be a progressive person. Good. Because of the fact that he was hated by the imperialists. But then so-called progressive people, for lack of a better word, like the Rodneys and everything, would say, well, we have to be very precise in our explanation to our people about why Idi Amin is not somebody to run after, you know?
Yes.
Because of the fact that, you know, I guess what I'm looking at is, I want to ask you to kind of relive some of that. I think Jonas Savimbi was one of the people you mentioned.
Yes, yes. So when I was in PAC,
Savimbi.
Yeah.
The Angola.
Yes, UNITA. Yeah. So one of the members of PAC, one of the central committee members, was named Kwajo Akpan.
Mm-hmm.
Kwajo had become very close. He had gone to UNITA. He had gone to the guerrilla camps in Angola and shot a film called Kwacha.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Kwacha means morning,
mm-hmm.
where he interviewed Jonas Savimbi, and he was in the guerrilla camp shooting, you know, the guerrillas preparing for war with the Portuguese.
Mm-hmm.
And so he brought that film back here, and it influenced many of us. And so we became supporters of UNITA based on
UNITA.
Based on the understanding or the misunderstanding, actually, that we had that they were more Pan-Africanist, Black nationalist in their orientation than the MPLA, which
that was their protocol. That was their command. Yes. I interviewed them in Lusaka. Anyway, I'm not going there right now.
No, go there, please, please. Say that.
No, this is you tell your.
No, you're adding on to what I'm saying. Please tell them what happened in Lusaka.
Well, I hadn't talked to Lusaka at all, so I can do that later.
Okay. So we were influenced by Kwajo Akpan, the movie Kwacha. He was putting out newsletters, and because we were in the organization and he was one of the leaders, we had been convinced that this was in fact, there were three movements. There was the UNITA, the MPLA, and the FNLA. And so we were convinced at that time that the UNITA was the most progressive of those. We later found out that the UNITA was being funded by the CIA, and the South African government was working in collaboration with them. We didn't know that at the time. And so we were kind of tricked. I don't want to say tricked, but we were misled into supporting a group. And this is why I think it's very important that our analysis is not just racial, right? Because you can have Black people who say, I'm for Black people, but they're still essentially in league with imperialists. And so I think that was
they're doing imperial work.
Yeah, I think that was the case with me.
What was the reason for y'all needing to make the distinction? You were trying to figure out who to send money to, or you were just studying? When you say
no, we were sending money. We were sending material aid. And remember, this was during the time when African Liberation Day was at a very high point. You know, I think ALD in the U.S., I think, started in 72. And so 72, 73, 74, 75 were very large marches in multiple cities throughout the United States. And we were also raising money at those marches that we would send to the liberation movements to buy whatever they needed to buy. So it was very important. We were not only providing material support, but we were rallying popular support for these liberation movements. And so, you know, again, we were misled.
I haven't heard the word UNITA for a long time, but that was the role, Kofi.
Yes.
I had not talked of Lusaka Conference.
What year was this Lusaka Conference?
I think it was the end of 1970. Y'all can look it up. Because when I went back home in 71 is when I broke with the PNC. After I went back home, Burnham had me on the delegation, Ghana's delegation to the Lusaka Conference. And I don't know why. I was not a public servant. I was not a minister. I was nothing. I was teaching in a private high school, small one.
This is the high school that you started. This is county high school.
No?
This is the high school that you started at that time?
Yes. Started in 1956.
That's the year I was born.
And but I was also engaged in a struggle against, like other people, Venezuelan claim on Guyana's land. And we were organizing land cooperatives.
That claim goes back that far? I thought that was just a recent issue.
It's not recent.
I didn't know that.
No, it's dates from 1899.
Old beef.
And it was revived by Venezuela in 1962. So when Bola asked, said he wants to put me on the delegation to the soccer conference, I instinctively decided not to fight it. He offered me also a national honor because they wanted people on the delegation to look important in the country, you know. He gave me some honor. I didn't even ask what the honor is. I said, no, thank you. No, thank you. Don't bother with that. Mr. Rampal was on the same delegation. Sir Sridhar Rampal, who died recently, and who became a big anti-apartheid dismantler. He was really very clever in his diplomatic work. Indian. He was on that delegation as Burnham's foreign minister. But Burnham really wanted me out of the way. He didn't want to leave me in Guyana because he had ordered his ministers to dismantle support for the land cooperatives. 13 of them were suddenly cut off. No more government support. And if I were at home, it would have been a big story. So I was taken out of the country. I didn't hear about it until I went back.
That's why you were sent to Lusaka.
That's why.
To get you out of the way.
Yes, get me out of the way to avoid the resistance that would build up. I used to go to places with ASQUIA, the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, and mobilize these things. You know, hold the unemployment seminar, talk about land and various things. But to come back to the Lusaka conference, I had to find things to do because I was not a public servant kind of thing. And during the conference and after, during the conference was in Lusaka, so we were living in Lusaka. I was in a place called the Annex. I was not in a hotel. Annex, that's for the second-rate kind of people. I found, I knew Kapepwe. Kapepwe was the vice president of Ghana, of Zambia. Kenneth Kaunda was the president. I was able to make connections with an official who organized for me to interview each of the liberation movements in Lusaka. And that's how I came to talk with UNITA. And what you're saying is very true. They're very plausible. Very plausible.
Did you interview Jonas Savimbi?
No. No. But I heard great tales about him from his members. They praised him as a nationalist, cultural and so on. But I spoke with Neto. Agostino Neto was in. And when I told him what I heard about Savimbi, who was the only one of the leaders actually in the field fighting the enemy, Neto looked at me and said, Savimbi is right here. In Lusaka, you know. You hearing me?
Yes.
He said, Savimbi is right here. Right here. It's not true. So I spoke to Neto.
This was before he was president.
Hmm?
This is before Neto was president. This is still during the liberation movement.
During the liberation movement.
Yes.
Yeah. During the liberation struggle. Yeah. And I clarified that situation. I got to understand it. Dr. Neto.
So the interviews you did in Lusaka with different liberation movements, do you have the records of those?
No. I wrote up the reports for the Prime Minister.
Oh.
And gave them to him.
Okay.
With a recommendation. I was interviewing them because Burnham wanted to know what's the most effective way of assisting the African liberation movement. Get it? So I interviewed each of the movements to find out what their problems were. And from that round of interviews, I interviewed several of them, all that were available.
Who are some of the which liberation movements do you remember besides MPLA?
Don't ask me that.
Okay, all right.
I mentioned, I talked with UNITA, I talked with MPLA, I talked with, I think, SWAPO. You know, I don't want to go down on record because I wrote it. I wrote these reports and gave them to the head of government who could do something. You know?
Do you think that those would be in the National Archives?
No. I can't tell. I was never in the cabinet. I don't know how they operate. I wrote, I typed the report and gave it to Burnham with a recommendation. These are the problems that the liberation movements have. And they were unanimous in saying that the chief problem, they don't need arms from Guyana. They get arms from the Soviet bloc. See? And China. What they needed was seed money. Arms would arrive in Ethiopia, but they wanted the arms in Namibia. You see? How to get them from Ethiopia to Namibia. It costs money. So they wanted that kind of cash. That is what I reported.
And they arrived in Ethiopia because of Ethiopia's independence?
Yeah, because Ethiopia was foremost.
Yeah.
In Ethiopia and Lusaka were foremost in the liberation. I think the Liberation Committee was in Ethiopia.
Yeah. Mandela talks about when Haile Selassie gave him a pistol. When they met, Mandela spoke about when they met, when he was on the ground.
Yeah.
And he met His Majesty, and His Majesty gave him a pistol.
Gave him a what?
A weapon.
Oh, I see, yeah. Anyway, something.
I was just trying to figure out why Ethiopia would be the transfer point, but you answered the question. Logistically.
Selassie, the Organization of African Unity was headquartered in Ethiopia.
Yes.
Was in Addis Ababa. The headquarters of the OAU, organization, now the African Union, was built by Israelis.
What?
Israel built it.
What?
They told me that.
Who told you?
The Secretary General, a man named an Algerian chap named Janus or something like that. I spent several hours with him. Israel was all over the continent. Israel was trying to win Africa and won a lot of Africa. Nkrumah was very partial to Israel. You see, Israel had come out of a long history of persecution, as you know. United Nations had to create a national home for them. And so they had a lot of goodwill, but they also had a lot of craftiness. And they knew what they were up to,
Mm.
you see.
Mm.
So this man, Janos, I think his name was, we had a lot of hours of conversation. He told me Israel built it. The OAU building in Addis Ababa. I haven't heard that from anybody else. People don't talk about it. But I knew they were doing cooperatives in several African countries and were well received because they saw the cooperatives as strategic, keeping people away from the Soviet Union. And I think that is why they invested a lot. They had cooperatives in Guyana. I went to Israel on Nkrumah's recommendation.
Oh, wow.
Nkrumah suggested that I go to Israel, and I told him of my interest in cooperatives. He arranged me to see the Israeli ambassador. I got a visa in quick time. I spent about a week in Israel.
This is my first time hearing this.
Huh?
This is my first time hearing this. What year was that? Around the same Africa visit?
The same African visit.
Wow.
And
that's Northeast Africa anyway.
I went there because they were Guyanese cooperative students in Israel.
Mm.
And I went there to see them and to see a kibbutz. I spent hours on a kibbutz. So when I heard kibbutz in the news the other day, I said, well, well, well.
What is a kibbutz?
A kibbutz is a cooperative farm where there is no money.
Mm. Mm.
Money is not recognized.
Mm.
And a very, very humanistic kind of relations, you know?
Mm.
I can't say much about them now. But people follow a very humanistic tradition, living style.
The cooperatives that Israel was the cooperatives that Israel was creating in Africa, were they agricultural cooperatives?
All kinds. Any kind of cooperative. Israel had a trade union called Histadrut. You heard it in the news?
No.
Histadrut is like the trade union council, but Histadrut was also an employer. Histadrut will have its own enterprises. You know, those people are very ingenious. They don't play. So here is this trade union movement, Histadrut. And Histadrut is a big employer also running industry and putting the funds into the union movement. So they have all of that going for them in relation to newly independent countries because they're looking for influence. You get it? Mm-hmm. They're buying influence. Mm-hmm. And they had it for a long time. It is only when the PLO came up and I don't know the inside of that, they had a lot of conflict about who will support the PLO and not support the PLO. Israel was very much against the PLO, Arafat and all of them. And the governments of Africa had to come down heavily. And that is when the thing began to break, you know? Yeah.
I never knew Nkrumah admired and supported Israel. Hmm? I never knew Nkrumah admired and supported Israel.
Yes. Nkrumah spoke well of Israel to me with cooperatives. And he rang the Israeli ambassador and told him to expect me.
Did you go to Six Pack?
No. We were banned.
Who, Guyana's banned?
The non-governmental elements from the Caribbean were totally banned from Six Pack. because of Burnham's behind the scenes arrangement with Nyerere.
What
Because we
what
were
behind the scenes arrangements? What behind the scenes arrangements?
I wasn't there.
No, you said Burnham had some behind the scenes arrangements with Nyere.
Then you have to work it out. Don't ask me. I said behind the scenes. I wasn't there. I know that. Well, listen. Burnham was the one in the Caribbean talking about Africa all the time. And he was the one, you know, the Sixth Pan-African Conference was supposed to be a non-governmental conference.
No, I didn't know that.
Look up the document. Look up the call. The call was drafted by CLR James.
I didn't know that.
Yes, read the call again. You know, CLR James stayed away from the conference.
No.
Boycotted it because they banned the Caribbean delegations. Trinidad, St. Lucia, Guyana, all non-governmental organizations from the Caribbean were banned, and they turned the conference into a government conference.
Walter was there though, right? He was already in Tanzania.
Walter Rodney was in Tanzania.
So he attended, but not as a representative.
I wasn't there, but I think he spoke at the conference. He had a standing in Tanzania. They won't risk that with him in Tanzania. But he made a critical presentation. They ultimately banned all non-governmental organizations from attending. Nyerere said he didn't agree with it, but that was the consensus, and he implemented it.
From the Caribbean, but there were non-governmental organizations from the U.S. that attended.
And he was afraid that some of us would go and expose the governments. What he did not know is that I did not intend to attend the Sixth Pan-African Conference as a delegate. I was giving way to younger people who had not gone to Africa. You get it? But that didn't come out because we didn't reach that stage. But I was not going to be done as a delegate. I had been to Africa and I know people were dying to go to Africa. So I wasn't putting myself down on that list. But they were afraid that I would go there and effectively expose the current dealings of the ruling cliques in the Caribbean, you know.
But like Baba Malik said, you're saying that there were non-governmental representatives from other places.
From the U.S. for sure.
So this ban was just by non-governmental entities from the Caribbean and Baba. Apparently.
There are documents to say. I know one man from the Caribbean who went, a man named Roderick Francis from Jamaica. Roderick Francis. He was always at the meetings of the I coordinated something called the Caribbean Liberation Steering Committee. That is what was organizing Six-Pack in the Caribbean. The Caribbean Liberation Steering Committee. I was secretary of that, coordinating it, holding meetings in Trinidad, in Barbados, in St. Lucia, in St. Vincent, at one time in Dominica, and getting the spirit of the Sixth Pan-African Conference, which came up during the life of the Caribbean Liberation Steering Committee. We didn't form it for that. We formed it independently to get rid of colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. And then the Sixth Pan-African Conference came up and we used it as an instrument. And there were so many young people anxious to get to Africa. And what I was doing was, I was in touch with CLR James, came to Guyana. We had a preparatory meeting in Georgetown at the town hall. During this time, oh yes, this is six back. During this time, I was in a hostile relationship with Burnham and his government to the extent that I decided Tim Hector and all of them from the Caribbean came to Georgetown for this preparatory meeting for the Sixth Pan-African Conference. CLR James was there himself, taking notes, and I decided not to speak at this conference. I invited an Indian organization, IPRA, led by Moses Bhagwan, because I am saying, in my mentality, we can't go along with rigging in Guyana and talk about apartheid. Get it?
Election rigging, you mean?
Election rigging. Bonham rigged the elections. Bonham rigged the 1973 election wholesale. I didn't even vote because for the first time I stood aside and observed what was going on, and I was convinced. After the voting, all the votes, all the ballot boxes were taken into the garrison, the GDF headquarters, and held for 2 days before they come to them. You understand? Naked like that.
So this is the year I was born.
Yeah. Naked like that. You predicted you win 2/3 majority and you win more than 2/3 majority.
Did you have any relationship with Abang in Jamaica?
Who?
Abang, organization that came out of the University of West Indies that Walter was involved in, and Mama Farika and some others.
What do you call it?
Abang.
Abang.
Abang. Boy, we used to get your papers. Abang, yeah. Clive Thomas was in it too. They banned Clive Thomas also. They sent him, they expelled him from Jamaica. Abang, yeah. I knew it.
I would like to ask, I want to bring food into this discussion. Baba Malik, you've been involved. You know, as I told my father when he was asking about you, he said, I told him you were one of my elders in the food movement, you know. How did your early involvement in, like you said, the PAC and all that, how did that influence your involvement into the food?
It totally shapes it, because for me, being food sovereign is a necessary precondition of having real independence. Even if you have political independence, but you're not controlling your food source, you're still dependent on those who are feeding you. And so for me, I'm not involved in agriculture just because I think it's a good idea. For me, it's part of the liberation movement. And one of the things I try to stress in the spaces I'm in is we're not just gardening for gardening's sake, and we're not just gardening so people get a healthier food. It's part of this larger project for me of African liberation. So my earlier work as a Pan-Africanist totally influenced what I'm doing now.
What if you could point to some moments of epiphany or whatever that sparked that just said the food, let me focus on food in terms of your early groundings?
Well, so for me, first hearing Malcolm X speak in when I was 13 in 1969, and hearing the message to the grassroots on a record, and having him talk about food and what he said, the house Negro and the field Negro, and what the house Negroes ate, what the field Negroes ate. And at that time, growing up eating a typical kind of African American soul food diet, my favorite food was chitlins, and
I just can't even picture it.
Yeah, Malcolm talked about that. And so it started me thinking about food within a historical and cultural context. Malcolm talked about during slavery in this country, the enslaved Africans who lived in the house ate better food than the enslaved Africans in the field.
Oh, I see.
And so he talked specifically about chitlins or pig guts. And growing up, that was my very favorite food, that my mother cooked that. And I love chitlins. But listening to Malcolm made me think about it within a historical and cultural context. So that's what started, but that still was just on a personal level, changing my diet. And really, it wasn't until Anand and I reconnected in the late 90s that I knew there was a food movement. He's the one that really introduced me to the food movement.
And Anand is the brother that was here the other day, Baba. Huh? The brother from Georgetown, from South, that was here with the Congolese brethren. That was here, the brother that was here last week. Yeah. The Rasta man from South, from the living in Toronto. That's who he's making reference to.
Oh, I see.
Good.
So before that, I was gardening, and I was, interested in health, and I was in the Black Liberation Movement, but I didn't know there was a food movement. And so Anand introduced me to that.
You didn't know what?
That there was a food movement.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So Baba, in Guyana, cooperatives and all these things you mentioned about.
Yeah.
What inspired those cooperatives that ended up being sabotaged when you came? Just in short, what kind of? I know that Guyana has a let me see, how can I put it? Our Guyanese ancestors have more of an unbroken relationship with the land, just as Africans in America in the South, But you mentioned this, like for instance, this is the first time I'm hearing that aspect of how not just with the overtime pay, but with the gardens and the revenue from the gardens is how our ancestors bought these villages that we now call home. This is the first time I'm hearing that part about the gardens, So when you got involved in cooperatives, the land cooperatives, as obvious as it may be or seem, what was the reason?
The big land movement in Guyana that we were involved in had to do with Venezuela's claim to Guyana, claiming empty land and giving them a footing to make the claim. So we said, if coastlanders went and settled on some of these lands and started active agriculture, it would show occupation. It would deny a foreign country the right to go and claim it. To say it was vacant and unemployed and unused and all of that. So they were infiltrating the borderlands and that kind of thing. They took over Ankoko, it's a military station. And we were saying if we were more spread out, occupying the land and doing agriculture, it was not a health food movement. It was a political and economic movement. Agriculture as a sector of the economy. Within it, people could practice their health choices as they chose. But that was not the main thing. Yeah.
So it seems like y'all are similarly situated in terms of.
I refrained from trying to tell people what to eat because the government had banned a lot of foods on very specious grounds. And I didn't want to get my wires crossed. Because the government had a reputation for compelling people what to eat and what not to eat. And so I had to let mine be by example.
What kind of things was the government compelling people to eat?
Compelling people not to eat. They banned things like sardines and cooking oil and all of that. All those things became very scarce. You had to line up to get them.
And they were banned because of what? They were coming from foreign countries?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Sardines came from Canada.
So that was the grounds that they banned them on, that they were coming from foreign countries. Interesting.
Shortage of foreign exchange. conserving foreign exchange and economic
Mm.
developments and so on. And they started to substitute poor foods for foods that had some nutritious value.
Mm.
In my opinion, cassava is a very poor food.
Naturally. And by the time I came around, I remember some of the health hazards that showed up in people like beriberi and
Yes,
everything.
beriberi and white rice. They would they would export all the brown rice,
Mm.
which is the one with the natural vitamins,
Yeah.
and sell people white rice,
Mm.
which gave beriberi and all the illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
So the land movement I talked about was not based on health grounds. People will stumble on the health things eventually,
Mm.
because it was a land occupation issue.
Mm.
Uh,
It's funny because when I reflect on my own, when people ask me how I got involved, one of the things is the example that your wife, my mother, set by our yard and many other places. Just being in a village, that's food everywhere, but we had bountiful food in our yard from every crevice and corner. But then another one was when you brought back some juices from Grenada. And that thing up to now, I think about it.
they call them nectar.
Because at this time, as you're saying, rice, brown rice is being exported and people being forced to eat cassava and white rice and everything in our country.
Yeah.
And I hear this place here, these people got their own juice?
Yes, I brought.
I'm telling you, to this day, this thing has a deep impact on me.
Was this after Grenada's independence?
Yes.
The Grenada Revolution. They
During Bishop.
coffee.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Did you know Maurice Bishop?
Huh?
Did you know Maurice Bishop in Grenada?
Oh yeah.
He was part of the
Oh yeah. He was part of this
the steering committee, right?
Oh,
yeah.
He used to come to Buxton.
Really?
He used to visit us.
But when my father would go to Grenada and bring these things back, I'm telling you that it still has this thing in my gut,
I can feel, as you're talking about, I can feel it.
Just in terms from
I feel how that stuck with you.
Again, not from the perspective of health, but from the perspective of power, some semblance of power, industry.
What a free country could do.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Baba, because hold on, just 1 second. I want to say that there's a documentary about the Grenada Revolution that is narrated or features people who were not assassinated in 83. Yeah. That anniversary was yesterday, as a matter of fact.
Was it?
Yeah, October 19th. That was yesterday. So
this one.
So hear me now, Baba. So this documentary spoke. In the documentary, they talked about what they had to do when they came to power. And this part of the documentary was called Feeding Ourselves. And the subtitle was Propaganda.
Yeah.
And they said that one of their main tasks was to change the narrative that it's honorable to eat imported foods.
Yeah.
And eating your own food from your land is something only for poor people.
Beautiful.
Imagine this, that they had to shift this narrative. And in places like Guyana, exporting food.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm saying? It's the same thing now in the Caribbean. Most of the Caribbean, that could be the breadbasket of the whole world. 75, 80% of their food is imported. Now, I'm talking about today, 2024. That's still the reality.
Yeah. How much percent?
75 to 80%.
Yeah. Yeah, just like that. I was trying to say that they didn't call those things fruit juices, they call them nectar.
Yes.
Nectar is a word you use in science. The sweetness from a fruit.
Yeah.
It's nectar from a flower.
Yeah.
So they had orange nectar and
yeah.
mango nectar and all of that.
I remember vividly as a little boy when you would bring them things.
Nectar.
I remember vividly. Wow.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you remember about Maurice Bishop?
He was a lawyer. He studied law in England. I never lived in England, so I knew him I knew him in the Caribbean. He came to Guyana. Um, he was part of the Liberation Steering Committee, the New Jewel movement. They had a chap named Franklin Harvey. You know that name?
No, I don't know that.
Yeah, he was a serious organizer. I think there was a woman named June Ward.
I remember hearing that name.
Huh?
I remember reading that name.
You remember it?
I remember reading the name.
You remember?
Reading that name, June Ward.
June Ward.
Yes.
People like that. Ferguson. Ferguson. Some of them were runners between Howard University, where CLR was, and Guyana. Every now and then they would come down with some document or something, you know. There's another woman whose name I don't remember. She was a lecturer. So Morris Bishop was in that kind of thing, and he was very busy because he traveled a lot, and he was determined that the Gary government should go. So he sought every sort of resource, you know, to bring that about. Tim Hector from Antigua, or the Revere brothers from Dominica. We were in touch with them. Now, Morris Bishop, what should I say? You ever saw him?
Yes, he came to Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
In maybe 1982, 83, something like that, and spoke before the city council. The same Ed Vaughn, who I talked about earlier, who just passed, arranged, he was an assistant to the mayor at that time. He arranged for Maurice to come to speak to the Detroit City Council.
He used to come and speak at public meetings in Guyana, public meetings of the Caribbean Liberation Steering Committee. His voice very articulate. Uh, the most important thing about Morris Bishop was some things are still within the security ambit.
Mm-hmm.
And I hesitate to talk about them.
Yeah. Naturally.
When they wanted to, when they were planning to overthrow the government of Gary, and I'm saying this in confidence, I was must be alerted that he was dealing with their enemy for a higher purpose. You understand?
Yes.
Very, very important, very principled.
That is my best testimony for Morris Bishop.
Thank you for sharing that.
My best testimony.
Did you know Bernard Core?
I've seen him. We may have exchanged, we probably exchanged greetings. I don't know if I had 10 minutes with him, but I know of him. I knew Morris Bishop for years.
You know, when I interviewed Don Rojas, I interviewed Don Rojas.
Don Rojas.
Several times.
I know that. I've heard you.
And he always spoke about how when they got the word, I have goosebumps.
Oh, what?
When they got the word of Uncle Walter's assassination.
Oh, yes.
The bishop was in the middle of a speech, and somebody came and whispered to him what had just happened. And he just stopped his speech and lambasted Burnham regime, you know?
Yeah, he let Burnham have it, man.
Yeah. So to hear that part, that aspect of the previous history, gives even more credence to his character.
Very principled.
Yeah.
So Don Rojas came to Detroit with Maurice Bishop, and it must have been 83, because I think the overthrow was in late 83. October, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So he was murdered yesterday in 83.
Yeah. So it had to be early that year, maybe March or April of 83.
So that was the same time he did the speech at Hunter College?
In that same time tour? It was probably on the same tour. Probably was. I'm not positive. I know he Howard too.
Yeah, because he said he was there as a guest of Trans-Africa.
That's right. That's right.
Randall Bishop, when that speech that I play on the radio from Hunter College.
Yeah.
He said that Randall Robinson had arranged his visit to the States.
Yeah, I remember that thing.
And therefore, that's where he made his round. But you were saying he came to Detroit.
Then after the invasion, Don Rojas came back to Detroit to rally support. And that's the second time I saw Don Rojas. And then I met him in Texas maybe 10 years ago.
Is he still alive?
Yeah, he's still alive. Yeah.
I need to get with him.
Don Rojas?
I don't know where he's living now, Baba.
He was in Texas. I think he's easy to find, though. I think you can Google it.
Where is he?
I think he's still in Texas.
Still?
Yeah. You know, I have to go in maybe 10 minutes because I have to hit the road and get.
Yeah, me. I do as well.
But I do want to ask.
You're saying he's still where?
You say he's possibly still in Texas, but
Texas.
That he's easy to find. I'm going to make it my duty to find him.
Yeah.
You're saying Baba Malik. Yes.
I didn't know Lon. I spoke to Don Rojas once or twice. I didn't know him too well.
So maybe I'll just ask one more question, and I don't know if I should even open up a new topic, but I'm going to do it. So based on what you see in the world now among African people, what's your assessment of where we are and where we should be going? What should we be doing?
I'm not qualified to answer that question.
I'm going to tell you that's not where you're going to answer. So you're not a soothsayer.
Okay.
I have notions from time to time, but I'm not engaged in a way that entitles me to answer that question.
Okay, I respect that.
There are several things I have to avoid because I don't know enough. I can't read anymore. I can't go on the computer and investigate as I used to do. I let young people are helping me write by dictating things, and I have to take into account that they have their lives to live. You know, I can't demand all their time. They have their lives, they have a family, so I have to go easy and reflect and reflect and reflect. I thank you for, I understand why you asked me that question. If I have anything to say from time to time, I will say it, you know. I will pass it on. You asked me a very important question, and I can give you one of the shocking conclusions I have come to. Very shocking conclusion. And if you take it in isolation, you will see me as some kind of savage or something. But let us go to a very important question of apartheid. The dismantling of apartheid in South Africa and its present state. I don't know anybody who is pleased with how South Africa is getting on.
Right.
These are things that go beyond revolution and revolutionary zeal. This is economic reconstruction. I don't know what's happening there. I hear the news. But one thing, when I heard of the Mandela time, Mandela was dramatically released, long struggle, exiles and all that. What's the name of that prisoner who got killed in his cell?
Steve Biko.
Huh?
Steve Biko.
Bito.
Biko.
Biko. I wrote a poem about him. I was trying to remember his name the other night. When you go to all that extent, exile and all that, an African majority, an Indian, a white minority dominating, and you set up a unity government. I thought the unity government would have been for a transitional period. It was for one period. That can't work. That cannot work. It is short-sightedness like that among revolutionaries that have held things up. Because all you're doing with that one term is to alarm the enemy that you're coming back. You have to be more devious than that. But that is just a hint. If you're having a unity government, it should be for a period that allows the influence of the whites to dissipate, while you allow the revolutionary forces to gain ground. If you do it just for one period, you're just alerting the world that they are finished. And very few people are going to accept that without resistance. So don't expect anything familiar in my answer, please. That's why I say it may shock you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think maybe
chestnut checkers.
And yes, I say this, I have never been to South Africa. I have never